This is Market Pathways, your premium guide to global medical device regulation, reimbursement, and policy. Become a part of the global MedTech community at mystrategist.com. On this episode of Market Pathways, we're bringing you an in-depth expert panel discussion on early feasibility studies. This panel comes from our virtual Dublin Innovation Summit Conference that took place earlier this year. If you're looking to connect with the best and brightest in the MedTech space, look no further than one of our global networking and investment conferences. Our next Innovation Summit Conference takes place November 1st through November 3rd at the Hyatt Regency Hotel in San Francisco. Save $300 when you register before October 12th. Register today on medtechstrategist.com/SF21.
I want to welcome everyone who's attending this virtual conference. And the panel today is on MedTech clinical trials, focusing on the return of early feasibility studies to the U.S. And I think particularly given what's happening with COVID, and we'll touch on that a little bit, the whole issue of clinical trials has just become critically important. And we couldn't have a better panel to talk about all the aspects of early feasibility studies. Let me start on my upper right, Rick Jeffrion. And Rick is an industry veteran, entrepreneur, and currently the CEO of Cereno Therapeutics. I don't know, do you want to take 30 seconds, Rick, and just tell everybody who Cereno is for people who aren't familiar with the company?
Well, Cereno, we're actually developing a therapy to restore smell and flavor function in those who have lost it long term, which is now a very prominent issue with COVID-19. Right.
And then on my immediate left is Jaime Walkowiak, and Jaime is the former COO of Baylor Scott and White Research Institute. Below Jaime is Chip Hance, another industry veteran. Chip was a longtime head of Abbott Vascular and then ran Regatta, and now is with Regatta. And Chip, do you want to take a minute to just talk a little bit about Regatta Medical?
Yeah, Regatta Medical is a private equity-backed firm that's building companies in the MedTech space.
Great. And then below me, Aaron Kaplan. And Aaron wears multiple hats. He's a professor of medicine at Dartmouth Hitchcock, an interventional cardiologist, and also an entrepreneur. And his current company is Conformal Medical. And Aaron, why don't you just, for those people who aren't familiar with Conformal, talk a little bit about the company?
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here. And Conformal is a clinical stage, privately held company that's developing next generation left atrial appendage closure technology designed to really allow for this to be a true one operator procedure done under conscious sedation as an outpatient.
So let me start out with a kind of a 30,000 foot perspective. And I think the best place to start is also, I need to talk a little bit about MDIC, because that is going to be a theme throughout our discussion. And I'm talking about the Medical Device Innovation Consortium, which is a public-private partnership that promotes the development of regulatory science. It's been a leader in working with all the different players involved in this process to improve the early feasibility studies climate in the U.S. And if you'll forgive a shameless plug for one of our publications, Market Pathways, if you want to learn more about MDIC, there's an in-depth interview with Pamela Goldberg, who is MDIC's CEO, as well as we've done articles on EFS and on real-world evidence. So I'd urge anyone who doesn't know MDIC to familiarize themselves with the group. And another reason why I want to bring it up is everybody here has really been involved in one way or another with MDIC, and particularly on the EFS front. Chip is head of the MDIC EFS working group, and Rick and Jaime, you co-chair the MDIC cardiovascular EFS steering committee. And Aaron, this has been an issue of longstanding interest to you, and also worked with MDIC on that regard. So let me kind of set the stage for our discussion today by kind of going back to a time, let's say up through the late 90s when the U.S. was really kind of the number one location for MedTech companies to conduct early feasibility studies. And then as things changed, particularly at the FDA, as regulatory timelines got longer, it just became harder and harder for companies to do these studies, which of course denied U.S. patients access to these kind of innovative devices. And the example that I like to use for that is Tavr. I mean, Tavr is a technology that I think clearly has been the biggest blockbuster technology that we've seen, in the last few years. Yet has been developed. Really, the two market leaders are U.S. companies, Edwards and Medtronic. I'm discounting, of course, Medtronic's Irish corporate registration, but and yet the U.S. was the 48th country to approve Tavr use after Albania, which I always find kind of interesting. So let's start by talking about why early feasibility studies are important to the industry. And what I'd like to do is have Chip start by giving us kind of a bigger company perspective, not speaking for Abbott, since of course you're no longer with them, but you've got that perspective. And then Rick and Aaron, having both worked more in the startup area, talk about what early feasibility studies mean for smaller companies. Chip, so why don't you start things off?
Yeah, well, thanks, Steve. Thanks for bringing attention to this topic. As you say, if you go back to the 90s, most cardiovascular device research was done in the U.S. It's the preferred destination, the best clinicians, and the largest market. So you would want to do the research where the R&D was done. But that became more and more difficult as FDA requirements grew. The challenges of getting these studies off the ground at sites was more difficult, and people found a faster pathway through Europe, through Southeast Asia, through Latin America. And with time, the U.S. became so difficult to get a study up and running that people went elsewhere. And then you had the outcome that you just described, where technology that was invented in the U.S. essentially went through its clinical experience outside the U.S. and slowed the entry dramatically to making that new technology available to U.S. patients. So in 2013, the FDA created the early feasibility study pathway, and it enabled.
You just froze. I don't know if you can still hear us.
Yes, and make novel technology available. And over the last 7 years, many companies have taken advantage of it simply because they get U.S. clinician feedback and more.
And I want to talk about that process at the FDA. But Rick and Aaron, let me go to you and talk about the importance of EFS to startup companies. And Aaron, maybe I'll start with you, talking about the perspective of having engineering teams be kind of able to easily access and observe first clinical use of new device, and talk about the role that this plays in developing a new technology, which is obviously critical to small companies that are often single company focused, single product focused.
Yeah, I think that as someone who's been in this process for a while, I'll give you kind of a tale of two startups. Triton, which developed the first dedicated stent for bifurcations, just like Chip said, U.S. backing, U.S. invention, U.S. clinical or preclinical development, first clinical use to Europe, and it's with as skilled operators as you can find, with well-infrastructured sites to really do the first clinical device. But I was intimately involved, had to bring all of our engineers went over there, and the day before we're highlighting the technology to the operators. They did a good job. We got good feedback. Then when the day was done, we'd come back, we would wait to hear what was going on in Germany, France, the Netherlands, terrific sites. But the ability to integrate the team with those operators is really limited. Fast forward 10 plus years to Conformal, we are now developing, we just completed our first phase of the EFS done in the US, also with some early data from Prague, but primarily in the US, and that our engineers work with a site that's 15 miles from the company. The primary operator is over all the time. His knowledge of the device far better, so it allows him to do better work with the device. Our engineers' ability to get quick feedback and multiple feedbacks, not just from an overbearing founder, is key. And also, it's highly efficient. That we do a study, we're able to get back and forth. We don't have to translate things. We don't have to send things halfway around the world. I mean, Australia does a great job, but sending your team over there and coming back, that's a multi-week effort. So the fluidity and also really integrating your team and the first operators who are really representing the primary market you're most focused on, huge value.
Rick, before Cyrano, you were involved on the cardiovascular side with Mitralign. Talk about, again, the importance of early studies to companies like Mitralign.
Sure. The EFS has really been one of the most important kind of regulatory developments really in the last 20 years. I mean, if you think about prior to the EFS, typically, again, you're going over to Europe for everything. All of your early investigation is in South America, maybe it's in Europe. Regardless, you're shipping, 6 to 9 people, all across multiple time zones. Usually they need to stay there for at least a full week, even if you're going to ship them there and back for one case or 2 cases, which is often the case when you're in something like structural heart, where the enrollment rates are low. You lose that team for an entire week. They're beat. You've lost their optimum thinking and all the things that happen. So, if you're a large company, what do? You establish a full organization over there, and companies like Medtronic and others, right? It's just established huge infrastructures in Europe and in other places to deal with the issue. But if you're a small company, you have 20, 30 people. You have, the inventors. You have, your head of R&D is integral. You may have a chief technology officer or a physician that's integral to the actual design and how that design should change in its early iterations. And so you have to bring those people to the site where those clinical cases are being performed. So literally, you're transporting most of the company, and you're affecting the operation of that company while that's occurring. So it's incredibly inefficient. It's also incredibly expensive. You're spending tens of thousands of dollars, and you're talking about companies that really want to burn at most in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, and they're spending $10,000, $20,000, $30,000 to ship teams over for multiple trips, multiple times per year and beyond. So incredibly inefficient. The advent of the EFS has allowed this early phase of investigation to happen here in the United States. By definition, during an EFS, you can change your design midstream within that study. So that's built into the design of an EFS. So it's incredibly friendly and incredibly efficient for US-based companies to perform US-based investigation. And then finally, what I'll say is that it's not just about kind of iterating your design and having your engineering teams kind of efficiently work. It's also about establishing a relationship with FDA as early as possible. In the old days, companies would literally complete their CE mark study before they would even start to perform research here in the United States. That's where things had gotten. Can you imagine FDA seeing something for the very first time when it was literally ready for a CE mark? Talk about throwing it over the fence. Right. So the opportunity to get involved early on at that early stage with FDA really helps FDA get educated on the device, the approach, and allows the company to truly initiate their pathway to approval in the United States much earlier.
Jaime, Rick mentioned infrastructure. Now, we've been talking about infrastructure within the company, but people who may not be familiar with EFS might overlook just the incredible range of people that are involved in this process beyond just the company and its engineers. You're talking about regulators. We've talked a little bit about FDA. We'll talk more about that. But you're talking about hospital or IRBs. You're talking about institutional contracting and budget administrators, which obviously means getting lawyers involved. And I joked about that because Jaime is an attorney.
Yes.
But also, the clinical side, clinical investigators need to be recruited. You need to have nurses and other staff who are recruiting patients. It's often struck me as kind of like herding cats. And you were at a major medical center, Baylor. And again, I'm not asking you to speak for Baylor, but you've had that experience. And talk a little bit as someone who's kind of headed those efforts for a major academic medical center. Walk us through how you coordinate all of these moving parts.
Sure. So it takes a lot of coordination, but we do it because it brings first in the world access to these innovative technologies to our patients. So this really helps benefit our patients. But you have to find the right investigator. And usually those investigators are pretty well known by these companies, and the companies contact them directly. But then you have to put the team in place, the team that can make it happen. So from putting it through the IRB and getting in front of them and explaining the risks and benefits so that they're comfortable approving the study, to getting the right team of research nurses, research coordinators, assistants, etc. And then also, I think education is a really big, important part of that. One of the things the investigators always did with me was get me involved early and often and educate me on what they were trying to do with the protocol, with the particular study, with the device, so that I understood from a legal perspective why we were going to move forward, even when sometimes there were lots of questions. So if you have someone that can help coordinate all these activities, it's certainly helpful, but it is a lot of coordination amongst a group of diverse individuals. But again, we do it for the patient. And it also helps build your research program overall by having access to these early technologies. People will come to you because you are a destination medical center for innovation. So it benefits the healthcare system as well.
And I want to get into some of the work that you've done to try to streamline this process through MDIC, developing templates and other tools to try to ease that process for companies and medical centers that are out there looking to get involved in that. But let me kind of get back to making sure we address the evolving problem. And Aaron, I was struck over the years by the surveys that you did at your 3D conference. And for those of you who don't know, it's the Dartmouth Device Development Annual Symposium. But you annually kind of surveyed your attendees on this whole issue of early feasibility studies, and you really saw an evolution in where the U.S. ranked in people's minds. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty striking. Every year we sent out the same survey, and I apologize. I did not look up the specifics of the data I will present are not adjudicated. But to the best of my recollection, about 6 or 7 years ago, in a field of 15, I think we were number 11. And this is, we asked people from both startup and large industry device developers, how they would rank different countries in terms of venue for during initial clinical evaluation. And U.S. came in the lowest tertile every time and pretty consistently. But over since efforts that was spearheaded by Jeff Shuren, Bram Zuckerman, Andy Farb, and I'm sure I'm forgetting somebody, they really worked to change this. And over the time, our last surveys, that the U.S. really comes up number 2 or number 1 as a most favored venue. And I think this really reflects leadership from FDA and also is seen in FDA's own data about filings that they have.
So that's a perfect segue, Chip, to the work that you did. You were an entrepreneur in residence at FDA around 2013 or so, when this whole effort that Jeff Shuren led, as Aaron described, kind of kicked off. Give us a feel for what that process was like. It culminated in a very important guidance document being issued. How hard was it to convince the agency to move ahead on that? Give us a feel for how that process worked.
Yeah, I mean, the context was pre-2012. The FDA review process for IDEs was taking on average over a year to get an approval. So that's just the industry sponsor negotiating back and forth on the clinical trial design, no activity, just negotiation to get an IDE approved in the United States. While I was at FDA, led by Dorothy Abel and Andy Farb, the creation of the early feasibility guidance document, together with some other streamlining activities, reduced that to 30 to 45 days. So saving a year out of the cycle of a development of a novel device. So in 2013, that became established, and a number of companies, Rick's was one, others pursued it, and found that the FDA process was streamlined. But then they would go to clinical sites and they'd find that the contracting took 6-8 months. IRB reviews took a couple of months. Budgeting was time consuming. And we did some work in 2015-16 to establish that the new baseline was taking nearly a year to negotiate with sites the actual beginnings of a clinical study. And clearly that was a problem and unacceptable for how to get clinical research done. So that precipitated the MDIC efforts to streamline, if you will, the activities between clinical sites, sponsors, and the various constituencies in the ecosystem.
Talk about the early goals. I've often heard the numbers 60, 60, 60 thrown around as a set of goals that in MDIC's EFS pilot study that they were trying to set for kind of each phase of the process. And Chip, let me start with you, and then Rick, if you want to jump in, and anyone else.
Yeah, we found that in Europe, in Australia, New Zealand, that the process to initiate a study, contracting, IRB review, initial screening could take 3-4 months. And when we looked at the U.S. processes, that was taking about a year. So we realized that we needed to benchmark that, and we established 60, 60, 60 as 60 days to get through the IRB process would be an efficient process. 60 days to get through contracting, which could be happening in parallel with the IRB process.
And then 60 days to get to your first patient. So that's the 60, 60 plus 60.
Right. Chip, you just froze up a little. I don't know if you could still hear us.
I think we lost Chip. Yeah. So at the time that the 60, 60 plus 60 was established, the approval for FDA was really looking very good.
Oh. So that was the advent of it. 60, 60, 60 was coining it.
Go ahead, Rick. Why don't you pick up?
Sure. At the time, the 66, Chip, you had broken up a little bit. So at the time, the 60, 60 plus 60 was established, the FDA was really approving these, approving the studies very quickly. And the IRBs were actually coming into line, within the 60-day metric. The contracts were not. The contracts were really out at about 5 months still. On average. And so, Jaime worked with a group of attorneys from the various clinical sites that have opted in to try and solve this issue and really created a master clinical trial agreement that is available on the MDIC website as one of the tools in the FS tool package. And using that can significantly decrease the amount of time. And Jaime, you may be able to quote on that, but I think we have examples now of, contracts being completed in as little as 60 or 90 days. And so they are able to bring things, we're able, I should say, to bring things in line with that 60-60 plus 60 metric that I think all of us would like to see as a standard, a gold standard for companies performing EFS.
Thanks for listening so far. This interview will continue after this short message. Market Pathways is the #1 publication that covers the people, challenges, and opportunities impacting the global medical device regulatory, reimbursement, and policy spheres. MyStrategist.com is your digital home to access all of our coverage and read the latest issue of Market Pathways. Your support is valuable and makes us better. Please remember to leave a review and rate Market Pathways on Apple Podcasts or wherever you happen to listen.
I want to follow up on that, but before we do that, let me just ask you, the early metrics, and granted, these were based on very small data sets, so I don't want to, make too many strong conclusions from this, but I thought it was interesting that the government metric, IDE approval, and the institutional hospital standard, IRB approval, were accomplished in shorter period of time, but the metric most closely tied to industry, which was contract approval time, took longer, which at first blush, one might think the opposite would be true. And let me just throw this out to anybody who wants to comment on it. Were you as surprised at that initial outcome, or did you expect that? Jaime, do you want to start?
Go ahead, Jaime.
So sure, I'll start with that. I actually wasn't surprised at all. I mean, I think the FDA did a lot of work to accelerate and improve their process, but there's still a lot of work at the site level. So some sites opt to use commercial central IRBs now, but even the ones that use their internal IRBs, I've never really found that they are the problem or create a significant delay, especially if the investigator shows up to that meeting to answer questions and educates the IRB on EFS. So I've seen situations where IRBs weren't educated and they didn't exactly know what they were looking at, because for some of these studies, they're just looking at animal data, or that's the only information that's provided to them along with the protocol. And that's not really what they're used to looking at. But once it's explained to them and they're educated and they have the opportunity to ask that investigator questions, I feel like that's a streamlined process. The contracting piece seems to be taking a significant amount of time. It's contracting and budgeting, and that's really happening together at the same time. And it's the lawyers going back and forth and presenting their own language, are not understanding some of the nuances that are in a contract that can really impact an EFS device, such as intellectual property. I think it was mentioned earlier on this call that the device itself could still be tweaked during that time. So we're making sure, companies want to be sure that they're protected in that IP provision, that if there's any discoveries or inventions, it comes back to them as the company. And sites also want to just be mindful of, an IP provision not overreaching into, let's say, an investigator's own lab. And as you experience with a lot of academic medical centers, a lot of these physicians and investigators are involved in research of their own. So it's just balancing and making sure that everyone's protected. And it can take a lot of time if two people don't get on a call and set the stage for that discussion. And a lot of times you see people behind their screens just sending contract language back and forth. So it really creates a delay. Rick, did you want to add in there?
Yeah, there are a couple of dynamics also that occur. I mean, if you're a large company, the language becomes extremely important to you. You have the deep pockets. You have to be careful what's in the contract language. So having something more standardized that could streamline that process and not make it different for every large company is really important. If you're a small company, you're a lot more forgiving in that stuff because these studies are life or death for you. So they'll give in a little bit of language. That's not the issue. Usually the issue with the small company is that maybe you've chosen a clinical site that hasn't fully committed administratively to the EFS program. EFS is like, you get approval for 10 patients, 15 patients, maybe it gets extended to 30 or 45. For that clinical site, it may only mean 4 or 5 cases. It's nothing that really has a big economic impact, per se, in absolute dollars. And so if you haven't preloaded the administration to readily accept and be efficient with this process, they push it to the side. We've had sites where the legal folks just didn't even pick it up for 6 months to review it because it wasn't a priority. So that's also a very important aspect, and it's important that you deal with sites that have already opted in to say, we're going to make this a priority, this early stage clinical investigation, because it's important to us.
Yeah, I'd like to pick up on two things here that both Jaime and Rick hit on, that this really has to be an all of the above approach. Conformal had a really terrific experience at Baylor. And why was that? Because Mike Mack really paved the way. Jaime and her team was focused. The PI, Molly Surslip, was engaged, and that a engaged PI backed up by a infrastructure that knows how to deal with it, with upper level management saying that this is a priority. Those are the ingredients that get this done quickly, and probably sets the stage for where the monkey jumps to efficient enrollment and flawless execution.
That's a great segue to the Baylor seminar. And Jaime, for companies that are watching this and are interested in trying to make the process more efficient and utilize some of the templates and other tools that you develop, talk a little bit about what kind of advice you can offer that came out of that on issues, for example, like managing risk, including I reporting, or just improving contract efficiency. Again, you've touched on that, but again, what kind of advice can you offer, particularly small companies? As Rick says, these are companies that kind of live and die based on these. Not that they're not important to larger companies, but to a lesser extent.
So the first thing I would do, any company that is going through the EFS process, I wish all of them would go to the MDIC website, and there you will find all of the tools. So none of this is a secret. You can grab and capture a consent form, a template consent form. You can access a clinical trial agreement that has been vetted by a number of sites already. And you will know which sites have actually looked at this document and what they can and can't agree to. I think some of the most beneficial information that came out of the seminar that we had at Baylor for legal contracting was even the supplemental materials, where one site might say, I can agree to this contract 90% except for this one provision, and that provision is this, and here is how we need to change it. So you will find all of that on the MDIC website, and I think that is a great start. We've written about this. We send out EFS Express newsletters where we'll talk about different topics and how some sites do something better than others. And again, they don't doing it better to keep it their own secret. They want to share that information, and that's why it's getting sent out through the EFS Express, and you'll be able to find those documents as well. So that would be my first recommendation. If any company, and especially the smaller ones, you have those tools already available for you and set up on the MDIC website. And then I would reach out. You want to find your champion. You definitely want to find your principal investigator champion at that particular site and have them shepherd this through the process. Engage their administration, engage their research coordinator and research nurse, because it's also really important to find the right patients, and they should be looking and thinking about that day one. So you want to find that person and engage the team and work directly with them. And I think that you should be smooth sailing from there on. Hopefully that's the goal.
Have you found that the legal departments, and again, not talking again about Baylor, but just generalizing this, are receptive to use of the templates and tools that you're suggesting? Or do you run into we've always done it this way, so we're going to continue to do it this way? So
I find that the sites accept the agreement that the sponsor sends them. And that's how this process usually starts. So sponsor sends them an agreement and they mark it up from there. If sponsors, especially these smaller companies, sent them that template that was already reviewed and agreed to that's on the MDIC website, you will really limit the amount of negotiations you will have to do if the site has already reviewed that template, if they were one of the participating sites or have since reviewed it. Because we've asked sites, if they've come on and gotten involved, to actually take a look at that template and provide their thoughts. So I think that will be a very helpful tool. What we've seen with some of the larger device companies is that they're supportive of this template, and they even participated in the development of it. However, a lot of times they have their own document that they would like for you to use. A lot of those larger companies, though, are also big fans of master clinical trial agreements. And if you have a master clinical trial agreement with a sponsor, that can also streamline the process, because this study, this EFS study, is just a work order. So you've already agreed to all of the legal terms, and this is just now saying you will be doing a particular study underneath that agreement that you've already entered into with some of those larger companies. So I do think, you know, the template CTA that's on the MDIC website, that can certainly help streamline the process for smaller companies. With larger companies, getting master clinical trial agreements in place is certainly key.
At the panel that you chaired during the last MDIC annual public forum that was actually held in public as opposed to virtually, I thought it was interesting. It seemed that the data indicated that awareness of these various templates and tools that Jaime's talking about was good, but usage remained low. I don't know if that has changed since then. And I'm just curious, any suggestions that any of you might have, and Chip, let me start with you, as to how we can kind of increase adoption of these tools, which seemed like they would be very useful, again, particularly for small companies.
Yeah, I just think that public forum was well over a year ago, and that may be dated information.
Okay.
But in general, I think this MDIC effort has been the best kept secret. And then we're doing events like this to get the word out. And we're trying to do that both in international and US forums as much as possible, despite coronavirus.
Yeah, and I would add that as someone who's seen it from both sides, is for the sponsor to remind the sites that, that they've been in this agreement, if they have. Because I've seen a lot of times sites will farm this out and not be aware. So awareness is a huge part of this, both on the sponsor and at the site level. And even if the sites haven't, articulating to a site that this has been used and been vetted by a site with similar objectives really is huge, and kind of breaks down a dynamic of, negotiators going in. We're going to start low, and we'll go real low because we know we're going to negotiate and really have this work and establish a collaborative dynamic.
Yeah,
I thought it was interesting also. Go ahead, Rick. You have
something that Jaime and I talked about last week was, maybe the tip of the spear really are these prominent investigators that are performing, all of these trials, because we're limited in knowing about this early company, right? That's just being developed. If they haven't fully promoted themselves, how do we know they exist? So how do we know to target them? So one great thing to do, or good thing to do, may be to literally figure out who all those investigators are, the ones that commonly investigate, cutting edge medical devices, and educate them, so that when the early stage companies come to them and the inventors come to them, they're aware and they can make the suggestion and help facilitate the use of the tools.
I thought it was interesting also that in information from the study sites, from the MDIC study sites, while budgeting and contracting, which we've touched on, were their greatest concerns, the next big issue on their minds seemed to be private payer coverage for IDEs. And only a small percentage of IDE applicants seem to apply for CMS coverage. And anecdotally, it appears that CMS is more likely to cover an EFS than it will a private payer. What do you think can be done, if anything, to try to improve private payer coverage? And do you think that's an important issue, or is that just a lower priority among many that arise in connection with EFS?
Well,
Anybody want?
it's important
Go ahead, Jim.
it's important for obviously companies to have a reimbursement strategy and get reimbursement as early as possible, as much as possible. But specific to EFS, you know, when you're performing your first 10 or 15 cases, you're what's known as category A. You're an experimental device. By definition, in EFS, you're allowed to change your design. That means your design's not set. That means it's experimental. So you're not eligible for device reimbursement, for example, at that stage. Once you've developed a certain body of clinical data, like at 30, maybe it's 30 cases, 50, it just depends, but you can consult with FDA on that. You get to a certain point where you can then apply to CMS for a category B and potentially get the device reimbursed, and you start to move along the pathway. So I would think you wouldn't really be able to address the private until you've really addressed the, you know, gotten to that category B, you know, stage, where you have at least a body of clinical data that could suggest that reimbursement is justified.
I want to tie this into pivotal studies. And Aaron, let me put this question to you about how our discussion of EFS impacts pivotal studies. I mean, should a company's push to pivotal be automatic? I mean, currently it's often seen as a marker or a milestone of success. Is that the way you think it should be viewed?
Yes, thanks. There are really two aspects of this. First of all, the engagement with the review team at FDA through EFS really gives them a familiarity and a fluency with what you're trying to do. And I think that's invaluable. The second thing, however, I'm seeing a lot of, you know, emphasis on, you know, EFSs and how quickly they transition to pivotal. And I think we need to be really cautious here, because I think success for an EFS study is the ability to evaluate a new technology in a safe way that yields really good data. Now, sometimes those data, of course, never with a company that I'm involved with, tells you that you need to go back to the drawing board, or maybe that this approach is not appropriate. From an EFS, maybe not from an investor perspective, but from an EFS perspective, that's a good outcome. And that is really what we're trying to do, is be able to test, you know, new technology, and not all of them are going to be successful. So when appropriate, you know, it really was the EFS allowing you to get good quality data in an efficient fashion while protecting a patient's safety. If you do that, that's what should be success. And yes, success, planning for success is moving to the pivotal is important, but it's not the only metric. And sometimes I'm a little bit worried that metric may overshadow some of these other issues.
You know, I would be remiss if I didn't raise the issue of what's happening from a regulatory perspective in Europe and the impact that has on early feasibility studies in the US. So we've seen the new medical device regulation, MDR, be postponed until May of 21 in terms of implementation due to the pandemic. But they've said they're not going to postpone it past that point. So at that point, I think it's fair to expect that the bar will be raised from a regulatory perspective for device companies in Europe. And as you all know, it's long been a practice of US companies to go to Europe, particularly when things were difficult here in terms of EFS, before the FDA kind of improved things, starting back in, you know, with that guidance back in 2012 and 2013. So what do you think the impact of MDR will be? And is it in many ways fortuitous that the climate is improving here in the US while it is getting tougher in Europe? So will that be a further impetus to companies coming back to the US to do their early feasibility studies? Jaime, do you want to take the first crack at that?
Well, I think it's so important that the FDA has created this pathway, especially when looking at everything that's going on in Europe. I think this is a great opportunity for companies to work on EFS within the United States, and I hope we will see more because of it.
Yeah. Aaron, you want to address that?
I would add that a slightly different tone is there's some great infrastructure and superb sites with terrific operators over there. And that, yeah, they're, I think, a little bit in the cold for a couple of reasons. The switch to the MDR has increased the uncertainty and the barriers. And also, we don't like to talk about this, but the European market, there's been a lot of price compression and makes it a less, inviting market. A lot of times, a lot of the push for going to Europe was to be able to prove not only clinical issues, but also to prove commercialization. And so if you make it harder to enter a market, and that market is more difficult to get reimbursement, that equation shifts. And I think that is another important aspect that's really important to develop your technology for the key markets that you're focused on.
Chip, you spent some time running Regatta over in Ireland. Again, not asking you to speak for Regatta, but you kind of experienced the device market over there, on a first-hand basis. What do you think the impact will be of MDR, especially in terms of EFS returning to the U.S.?
Well, I think you laid it out pretty well. I think it's fortuitous that the U.S. has gotten easier, and I don't think there's any question that more European companies or U.S. companies who are planning on research in Europe are going to look more strongly at the U.S. I would say this fall, in a very short-term focused, with the rise of coronavirus cases in Europe, it's gotten to the point that a lot of EFS type research in Europe is completely shut down. People just can't even get into the institution, or they can't travel to the institution to be able to conduct research. So I know that's a problem in the US too, but it's especially acute from several companies I've worked closely with in Europe that it's brought clinical research at the early phases to a screeching halt.
Let me ask you, I know Regatta is more of a private equity play, but let me ask you to put your investor hat on. And if a startup company, MedTech company, came to you and asked if they should go to Europe to do their early studies and early commercialization, which has been, again, kind of so common in the past, what would your advice be to them?
For most startups, and I'll give this advice publicly or privately, I recommend you hedge your bets. I think you've got to look around the globe and plan on a two-pronged strategy. I would include US as one of those prongs. I'd look at Australia, New Zealand as a second prong, Eastern Europe possibly as a second prong. And I think you have to do your feasibility research in two locations in order to make sure your timeline isn't crushed by something happening outside of your control. So I think that's what startups have to do in order to protect their funding effectively.
Rick, in your past lives, you've spent a lot of time in Europe doing studies and early commercialization there. What would your advice be to, and again, not talking about your current technology, but just generally speaking, if a startup CEO were to come to you and ask for your recommendation, what would you tell him or her?
I think Chip's advice is well taken. The two-pronged strategy that he suggested is the right way to go. You can consider certain sites in South America as well, some that are well known in specific sectors. But it's going to be, performing your very first cases, your first 3 to 5 or whatever, is one thing. The other thing that's really important to build value, though, and both within the clinical community in terms of acceptance and with potential strategics, et cetera, is developing a real body, right, of clinical data at good, credible sites where people accept the outcomes from those sites and in that data. Europe used to be the place to do that, primarily because you weren't able to do that early stage in the United States. The United States now can be a place to do that, because you can start with your 10 or 15 cases in your EFS, and then you can get a 15 patient extension and another extension. And we were able to do that. We were able to get our extensions approved even before we had finished the first round of 15. So you're able to keep a continuous study going. You could build that into a 60 patient study or more and build that credible body of clinical data, which is so important to finance your company to the next step, or partner with a strategic, or get the clinical community to accept what you're doing, all those things. So those are really important. I really wish Europe was still a place to do that. It's just that the regulatory policies now have really shut companies out from getting in and doing what they used to do there.
So I've ignored the 800-pound gorilla for as long as I can, but let me close by talking about the pandemic. It's had a huge impact on MedTech clinical trials in a variety of ways. You've all seen, experienced it. Increasing the focus on remote tracking, various telehealth tools. How do you think the pandemic will affect EFS? And perhaps most importantly, whenever this goes away, do you see any of these changes becoming permanent and becoming a part of this whole process? Jaime, to start with you, do you see any of these new tools becoming kind of a part of the armamentarium to conduct early feasibility trials going forward, even after the pandemic is gone?
I think that we've had to look at a lot of our studies to keep them up and running in a different way. And we did this especially at Baylor, but I've talked to people at sites across the country where they've done more home monitoring visits and drive-by check-ins and some of these things that we just never really did before, but we were trying to think outside the box so we could continue with all of our studies. And I think that what we found is that even some of these things that we've done, it's easier for patients, and you're probably staying in touch with them even more so, right? That with our video capabilities and our technology. And I think we will use technology more in carrying out these studies in the future. So there's obviously been a lot of negatives, but just taking a look at how you can really carry out these research studies and what is best for the patient, I think has been the focus. And we've definitely relied on technology to do that. And I feel like that has been one of the greatest benefits.
Trip, let me phrase this slightly differently. One thing about MDIC, it has been, again, cutting edge in terms of regulatory science. To Jaime's point, has really worked hard to try to include patient, to be a patient-centric focus and bring the patient perspective into these issues. Do you think those perspectives will carry over kind of post-pandemic, and we'll see some of these, again, telehealth or remote tools become part of the process?
Telehealth's definitely here to stay. This has been a watershed moment for telehealth because it wasn't just about, these great technologies were in development, but it was really about having both sides accept that it's okay to do it. That it's kind of okay for me not to physically come see you. It's really, before it was really important for me to go there, be with you, make that statement. And now, not that it isn't important, it's still going to be important. Human contact's always going to be important. But I do believe there's going to be a balance between the two. We can't be all telehealth, and we can't with no physical contact with each other, and we won't be the other way, which is the way it used to be. So it's going to be a balance between the two, and I think that's what will come out of this pandemic.
Aaron, you've had the clinical side of things, and I'm imagining that your practice has changed to a degree. What do you see the future like, and how will it impact EFS?
Yeah, thanks. And I want to echo a little bit of what Rick had to say. I think that the ability to do things with a telehealth focus is now part of our vocabulary. But we need to be very careful. And I think it allows us to say, oh, do we have to do everything, in person? Do we need an NIH stroke scale? Or can we do that remotely? But I also am concerned as we look at other things that the pandemic has uncovered in terms of underserved populations. I'm finding my own practice is that the patients of mine who can't get on a video like this are often the underserved. And I think that may be not EFS centric, but it is centric to larger studies and to healthcare in general. So I think we need to be really careful as we move forward in that way. I also think that in terms of EFS, you no longer, I think we're getting on airplanes far less, that we can have a pre-sub meeting that doesn't necessarily have to be in person, and to spend a day for an hour meeting at FDA. I think that's no longer expected. So there are going to be things like that make it more efficient. But I agree that telehealth and will be part of the vocabulary. But I think as we move forward, we have to be very careful to be able to use it appropriately.
Chip, I'd like to give you the last word. What role do you see? Do you see these increased efficiencies resulting in, I don't want to say a silver lining, but in other words, do you see kind of positive aspects in terms of technology coming out that might improve the EFS process going forward?
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing that hasn't been mentioned is call it telehealth for proctoring. I've seen some companies literally mount iPad screens on IV mounts and wheel them into rooms so that the physician can do remote proctoring for cases, which is also an innovation. So I think these innovations are here to stay, and it's very exciting to see that precipitated by a challenging event.
Great. Well, on that note, I want to thank each of our panelists. This has been a fascinating discussion. So again, thanks to everybody. Really appreciate your help, and have a good rest of the day. Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
We hope you enjoyed that episode. Your support is valuable and makes us better. Please remember to leave a review and rate Market Pathways on Apple Podcasts or wherever you happen to listen.